The house looked exactly as I remembered it. Warm light spilling from windows, wreaths on every door, my mother's collection of ceramic angels glowing on the front porch. A picture-perfect Christmas Eve in suburban Virginia. What none of the neighbors knew, what none of the 14 family members gathering inside understood, was that I had paid off the mortgage on this house 8 years ago. Every brick, every shingle, every strand of twinkling lights existed because of money I wired home from aircraft carriers stationed thousands of miles away. I sat in my rental car for a moment, gathering myself. 3 years since James died. 3 years since my husband's ship went down during a rescue operation in the Philippine Sea, and my family had acknowledged his death with a group text message. "Sorry for your loss. Let us know if you need anything." They didn't come to the funeral. My father had a business meeting. Marcus had a vacation planned. Sophia was too busy with her dermatology practice. The practice I had secretly funded through medical school. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. No makeup, simple navy dress, small gold earrings James had given me on our 5th anniversary. Diana would probably comment on how plain I looked. She always did. Inside, the house swelled with noise and warmth. Cousins I barely knew embraced me with perfunctory hugs. My mother kissed my cheek, her eyes carrying that familiar mix of love and apology she never voiced. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot closest to the kitchen, where I could help serve and clear dishes. The spot where I was least visible. My father stood at the head of the table, champagne glass raised. Richard Vasquez, 69 years old, still carrying himself like the successful businessman he'd never quite become. His 3 failed ventures had nearly bankrupted the family twice. Both times, anonymous wire transfers had appeared to save them. Both times, he'd credited his own financial genius for the recovery. "A toast," he announced, his voice carrying that theatrical warmth he reserved for audiences. "To family, to another year of blessings." He turned to Marcus first, his golden boy, wearing a Rolex I had secretly purchased through my parents for his birthday. "To Marcus, who has worked so hard to carry this family's legacy forward. Your new business venture is going to be incredible, son." Marcus preened. His 3rd business, funded by $80,000 from a trust he believed was an angel investor. That angel was me, deployed in the Pacific, sending money home between operations. "And to Sophia," my father continued, beaming at my sister. "Our brilliant doctor, you've made us so proud. A dermatologist, everyone. The first doctor in the Vasquez family." Sophia smiled graciously, accepting the applause. She'd graduated from medical school debt-free, thanks to a scholarship fund that existed only in the paperwork I'd created. $240,000 over 4 years. She'd never questioned where it came from. "What about Alina?" My Aunt Rose's voice, genuinely curious. "Isn't she in the military?" The table went quiet. My father's expression flickered, something cold passing behind his eyes. "Alina," he said my name like it tasted strange. "What has Alina ever contributed to this family? She floats around on boats while the rest of us build real lives." The words hit like shrapnel. Quiet, precise, devastating. Marcus laughed. "Her little boat job, I bet she makes less than my assistant." "Some of us actually had to work for our degrees," Sophia added, sipping her wine. "Not everyone gets to play sailor and call it a career." Diana leaned forward, eyeing my dress. "Is that what you're wearing, Alina? I have some things I was going to donate. You're welcome to look through them." I felt my hands go still on my water glass. Military composure taking over, the same stillness that had served me through combat operations, through evacuations, through standing on the bridge of an aircraft carrier, and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. I looked around the table at the faces of people who had built their entire existence on my salary, my sacrifices, my silent and invisible support. My father was still talking, something about how some children contribute and others just take up space. Marcus was laughing. Sophia was nodding. And I sat there, surrounded by the life I had funded, the comfort I had provided, the family I had carried on my shoulders for 15 years. They lived on the waves, I commanded, while mocking the sea. I picked up my fork and continued eating. The The ham was overcooked. It always was. I should tell you how it started. How I became the invisible pillar holding up a family that refused to see me. When I was 17 years old, I received an acceptance letter to the United States Naval Academy. I remember the weight of that envelope in my hands, the way my heart pounded as I read the words. Full scholarship. One of the most prestigious military institutions in the world had looked at my grades, my athletics, my essays, and decided I was worthy. I ran downstairs to show my father, certain that this would be the moment everything changed, that he would finally see me. He was sitting in his office, surrounded by paperwork from his second failing business. I handed him the letter, barely able to contain my excitement. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he tore it in half. "This is a waste," he said, dropping the pieces into his waste basket. "The military is no place for a girl. You'll get married, have children, and abandon whatever silly career you think you're going to have. I'm not letting you throw away your future on playing soldier." I stood there, frozen, watching the torn edges of my dream flutter into the trash. My mother appeared in the doorway, saw what had happened, and said nothing. She never said anything. What my father didn't know was that I had applied without his permission. What he didn't understand was that at 18, I didn't need his consent. I retrieved the letter from the trash that night, taped it back together, and 3 months later I left for Annapolis. He didn't drive me to the airport. He didn't say goodbye. My grandmother, my father's own mother, was the one who took me. She had served as a Navy nurse in Vietnam, and she understood what this meant. She pressed her old service pin into my palm and told me something I've never forgotten. The ocean doesn't care about their opinions. Neither should you. 4 years later, I graduated and received my commission as an ensign in the United States Navy. It was one of the proudest days of my life. My grandmother sat in the audience, tears streaming down her face as I took my oath. The seat I had reserved for my father was empty. He had a golf game, my mother explained when I called home that night, an important one with potential investors. My grandmother died 2 years later. She never got to see me make lieutenant or lieutenant commander. She never got to see me earn my Bronze Star or take command of my first ship. But I've carried her service pin in my pocket through every deployment, every promotion, every moment when I wondered if I was good enough. She believed in me when no one else did. At 28, I was deployed on my first major assignment, serving aboard the USS Carl Vinson. I was working 18-hour days, learning every system on that ship, pushing myself to be better than anyone expected. One night, I called home to check in and discovered that my parents were 3 months behind on their mortgage. My father's third business had failed. They were facing foreclosure. I wired them $15,000 the next morning. I didn't tell them it was from me. I had my accountant set up a trust and present it as an inheritance from a distant relative. My father accepted the money without question, never wondering why a relative he'd never met would leave them such a specific amount at such a convenient time. That was the first time I saved them. It wouldn't be the last. At 30, Marcus called me in tears. His first business, a restaurant he'd opened with money he'd borrowed from friends, was drowning in debt. Creditors were threatening to sue. He needed $80,000 or he'd lose everything. I was in the middle of a deployment in the South China Sea, coordinating naval exercises, but I spent 3 hours on a satellite phone with my financial advisor, arranging for an angel investor to bail Marcus out. He never knew. When the money appeared, he thanked my father for pulling strings. My father took the credit without hesitation. Sophia's turn came when she got into medical school. She called the family, ecstatic, then immediately panicked about how she'd pay for it. $240,000 over 4 years. My father suggested she take out loans. My mother suggested she defer. I created a scholarship fund through my accountant, complete with a fake application process that Sophia won. She wrote a thank you letter to the fictional foundation, expressing her gratitude for believing in her potential. I have that letter in a box somewhere, along with all the other evidence of my invisible support. By the time I was 33, I had paid off my parents' mortgage entirely, funded Marcus's second business failure, covered Sophia's tuition, and started contributing to my parents' credit card bills whenever they got out of control. I was also commanding my first ship, a guided missile destroyer with a crew of 300 sailors who depended on me for their lives. I had earned my Bronze Star for actions during a combat operation I still can't fully discuss. I had led the evacuation of 2,000 civilians during a typhoon in the Pacific, coordinating helicopters and rescue boats, while waves crashed against our hull. None of this existed in my family's reality. When I came home on leave, they asked if I was still working on boats. They didn't know what a commanding officer was. They didn't understand ranks or deployments or the weight of responsibility I carried. My father once asked if I'd met any nice officers I might want to marry, as if that was the only value my career could provide. I did meet someone, James, Commander James Reeves. He served on a destroyer in the same carrier group. He understood the life, the sacrifice, the long months at sea, and the constant awareness that any day could be your last. We got married on a beach in San Diego, just the two of us and a Navy chaplain. My family didn't come. My father said beach weddings were tacky. Marcus had a business trip. Sophia was preparing for her board exams, the ones my money had paid for. James knew about my family. He knew about the money I sent, the anonymity I maintained, the constant hope that someday they'd see me for who I really was. He begged me to stop. "They don't deserve your loyalty, Lena," he said one night, lying beside me in our small apartment near the naval base. "You're one of the most respected officers in the fleet. Admirals know your name, and your own father thinks you're a failure." I told him it wasn't about deserving. It was about family, about being the kind of person who doesn't abandon people, even when they've abandoned you. James died 3 years ago. His ship was conducting rescue operations in the Philippine Sea when a rogue wave hit. He saved 6 sailors before the water took him. The Navy buried him with full honors. Admirals attended his funeral. His commanding officer called him one of the finest men he'd ever served with. My family sent a text message. I stood at his grave in my dress uniform, surrounded by hundreds of sailors who had come to pay their respects, and I read the words on my phone. "Sorry for your loss. Let us know if you need anything." That was the moment something cracked in me. Not broke, not yet, but cracked. A fracture that would widen over time, that would grow with every dismissal and every insult until finally, it would shatter completely. But I kept sending the money. I kept paying the bills, because James had believed in loyalty, and I couldn't let go of that, even after he was gone. By 42, I was a Navy captain, 06, commanding Carrier Strike Group 7. The USS Theodore Roosevelt and its entire fleet answered to me. 5,000 sailors, billions of dollars in assets. I had dined with admirals and briefed Pentagon officials. I had made decisions that shaped international policy. I was one of the highest-ranking female officers in the United States Navy. And my father still thought I worked in an office on a boat. I never corrected him. What was the point? He had decided who I was when I was 17 years old, standing in his office with a torn acceptance letter at my feet. No amount of medals or promotions or achievements would change his mind. So I let him believe whatever he wanted to believe, and I kept paying the bills, and I kept showing up for Christmas dinner, and I kept sitting at the far end of the table where I was least visible. Until this year. Until he looked me in the eyes and told everyone I had never contributed anything. Dinner dragged on for another 2 hours. I ate without tasting, smiled without feeling, answered questions about my little job with vague responses that satisfied no one and provoked more mockery. By the time dessert was served, my father had made 3 more comments about my lack of ambition. Marcus had joked twice about my government salary. And Sophia had managed to work in a comparison between her medical degree and my vocational training. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment away from the table, away from the faces of people who saw me as nothing. The hallway was lined with family photos, and I paused to look at them. There was Marcus's college graduation, Sophia's white coat ceremony, my parents' anniversary party. I counted 17 photographs on that wall. I wasn't in a single one. Not one. I had been cropped out of family history as efficiently as I'd been cropped out of their gratitude. The daughter who didn't exist, except when bills needed to be paid or emergencies needed to be handled. The invisible woman who kept everything running while everyone else took the credit. I splashed water on my face in the bathroom and stared at my reflection. 42 years old, commanding officer of a carrier strike group, decorated combat veteran. And here I was, hiding in my parents' bathroom like a wounded teenager, trying not to cry over the same rejection I'd been experiencing for 25 years. James's voice echoed in my memory. "They don't deserve your loyalty, Lena." My grandmother's voice answered him. "Know when a battle isn't worth fighting." I dried my face and stepped back into the hallway, intending to return to the table. But voices from the living room stopped me. My father and my cousin Roberto, talking in low tones they thought no one could hear. "Elena's always been the slow one," my father was saying. "Not like Marcus and Sophia. They've got drive, ambition. Elena just floats through life, waiting for someone to take care of her." Roberto murmured something I couldn't hear. "I just hope she's saved enough from her little government job to take care of herself," my father continued. "Because she's never going to amount to anything. It's sad, really. Her mother and I tried our best, but some children just don't have what it takes." Sophia's voice joined them, bright with alcohol and cruelty. "She probably thinks she's important because she wears a uniform, like putting on a costume makes you special." They laughed, all three of them, laughing at the idea that I could ever be anything worth respecting. I stood frozen in that hallway, 15 years of silent sacrifice burning in my chest. Every wire transfer, every anonymous payment, every bill I'd covered, an emergency I'd handled while deployed on the other side of the world. Every Christmas I'd shown up hoping things would be different, every dismissal I'd swallowed with a smile, every piece of my heart I'd given to people who threw it away without a second thought. The crack that had formed at James's funeral split wide open. I didn't make a scene. I didn't storm into the living room and confront them. That's not who I am. I've commanded sailors through combat operations, maintained composure while making life-or-death decisions under impossible pressure. I don't explode. I assess, I strategize, and I act. Instead, I walked quietly to the front door, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside into the December night. The cold hit me like a slap, sharp and clarifying. I stood on the porch of the house I had paid for, looking up at the same stars I navigated by at sea, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, something quieter and more final. I pulled out my phone and called my financial advisor. David had handled my accounts for 12 years. He knew about the trusts, the anonymous payments, the elaborate system I'd built to support a family that despised me. "Elena," he answered, surprised to hear from me on Christmas Eve. "Is everything okay?" "I need you to stop all payments," I said. My voice was calm, steady, the same voice I used on the bridge of my carrier. "Everything, tonight." There was a pause. David knew what this meant. He'd questioned my generosity more than once over the years, gently suggesting that perhaps my family didn't deserve my support. I'd always dismissed his concerns. "Are you sure?" he asked. I looked back at the house, at the warm light spilling from windows, at the life I had built for people who saw me as nothing. The mortgage payments on my parents' house, the monthly transfers to Marcus's business account, the remaining payments on Sophia's student loans, my parents' credit card payments, all of it. Stop everything. "Elena, he calculated quickly. "That's over $8,000 a month. Your parents will notice immediately." "I know. The mortgage will go into default within 90 days. Marcus's investor funding will disappear. Sophia's loans will start accumulating interest again." "I know." Another pause. "May I ask what happened?" I watched my breath fog in the cold air, dissipating into nothing. "They've been funding their contempt with my sacrifice for 15 years, David. I'm done being invisible." "Understood." His voice warmed with something that sounded like approval. "I'll process everything tonight. Consider it done." I hung up and stood there for a long moment, waiting to feel something. Guilt, maybe, or doubt. Some part of me that would insist on going back inside, apologizing for nothing, resuming my role as the family's silent provider. But there was only stillness. The same stillness I felt when making command decisions, when the weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders and there was no room for second guessing. I didn't need them to see my power. I needed to stop giving it away. The door opened behind me. My mother stepped onto the porch, wrapping her cardigan tighter against the cold. "Elena, what are you doing out here?" I turned to look at her. Linda Vasquez, 65 years old, complicit in decades of silence. She had watched my father tear up my acceptance letter and said nothing. She had watched him mock and dismiss me for 25 years and never once defended me. She knew where the money came from, I was certain of it. She had to know. But she had never acknowledged it, never thanked me, never once stood up and told the truth. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, to force her to see what she had allowed to happen. But that wasn't the battle I needed to fight tonight. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "Already, but we haven't done presents yet, and your father." "Mom," I stopped her with a word. "I'll call you tomorrow." I hugged her briefly, feeling her thin shoulders beneath the cardigan. For a moment, I thought I felt her hold on tighter than usual, as if she knew something was ending. But then she let go, and I walked down the porch steps to my rental car without looking back. As I drove away from that house, away from the family that had never seen me, I made a promise to myself. I was done being the invisible foundation, done being the silent provider, done giving everything to people who gave nothing in return. Let them learn what I had learned at sea. You can't sail on someone else's strength forever. Eventually, the ocean demands that you learn to swim on your own. I didn't know it yet, but the next 6 months would bring a reckoning none of them could have imagined. And when it came, when they finally saw who I really was, it would be far too late for apologies. I returned to San Diego 2 days after Christmas and threw myself into my work. The USS Theodore Roosevelt was preparing for a major deployment to the Western Pacific, and there was no shortage of tasks requiring my attention. Briefings, training exercises, equipment inspections, personnel reviews. I commanded over 5,000 sailors, and every single one of them depended on me to be focused, present, and fully engaged. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't distracted by family emergencies or anonymous wire transfers or the constant low-grade anxiety of wondering what crisis would require my invisible intervention next. The money I had been sending home stayed in my accounts. The mental energy I had been pouring into people who despised me went instead into my crew, my mission, my ship. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. Like setting down a weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. By February, we were deployed. The Roosevelt and her strike group sailed into the Pacific, conducting exercises with allied nations, maintaining presence in contested waters, doing the work that most Americans never see or understand. I stood on the bridge of my carrier and watched the sun rise over an endless ocean, and I thought about my father sitting in his comfortable living room, mocking my little boat job, while I commanded a floating city of sailors and aircraft worth billions of dollars. I didn't think about what was happening at home. I couldn't afford to. But David sent me updates when he could, brief encrypted messages that painted a picture of slow-motion collapse. January, the first mortgage payment bounced. My parents received a letter from their bank, politely inquiring about the missed payment. My father called the bank to complain, insisting there must be a mistake. There wasn't. February, Marcus's business account showed a zero balance where the monthly investor deposits used to appear. He called the investment firm I'd created, only to discover that the firm had been dissolved. No forwarding address, no explanation. He started making panicked calls to anyone who might lend him money. No one would. March, Sophia received notice that her student loan payments had stopped. The scholarship fund that had been covering her remaining balance had closed. She called the fictional foundation's phone number and got a disconnected signal. For the first time in her life, she had to start making payments on her own debt. April, my parents' credit cards were declined at a restaurant. The cards I had been quietly paying off for years had reached their limits, and without my monthly contributions, they couldn't make the minimum payments. My father blamed fraud. My mother blamed the bank. Neither of them considered the possibility that their invisible benefactor had stopped giving. By May, the family group text was exploding with panic. I saw the messages when I could access communications, hundreds of them, increasingly desperate. Marcus's business was failing. Sophia was drowning in loan payments she'd never had to make before. My parents were 3 months behind on their mortgage, and the foreclosure process had officially begun. And through all of it, not one of them thought to ask me for help. Why would they? I was the family failure, the one who'd never contributed anything. What could I possibly offer? It was my mother who finally broke the silence. A voice message left on a satellite phone I rarely checked, her voice thin and frightened in a way I'd never heard before. Alina, something strange is happening. Your father won't tell me the details, but I think we're in trouble. Real trouble. If you know anything, if there's anything you can do, please call me back. I listened to that message 3 times, standing in my quarters aboard the Roosevelt, the hum of the ship's engines vibrating through the floor. Part of me wanted to call her immediately, to fix everything, to resume my role as the invisible savior. Old habits don't die easily, especially ones built on love and obligation, and the desperate hope that someday, if I just gave enough, I would finally be seen. But I didn't call. Not yet. They needed to understand what they had lost before they could appreciate what they'd had. In June, my father finally did something he should have done years ago. He typed my name into Google. I know this because Marcus told me later, during a conversation I'll describe in time. He said my father sat at his computer for 3 hours, scrolling through article after article, his face growing paler with each revelation. Navy Captain Alina Vasquez commands Carrier Strike Group 7. Captain Vasquez receives Navy Distinguished Service Medal for leadership during Pacific operations. Bronze Star recipient Captain Alina Vasquez leads humanitarian mission after Typhoon Maysak. There were photographs. Me on the bridge of the Roosevelt, binoculars raised, scanning the horizon. Me shaking hands with admirals, with senators, with the Secretary of the Navy. Me standing at attention while medals were pinned to my chest, my face composed and proud while hundreds of sailors saluted. My father learned, in one devastating afternoon, that his useless daughter commanded an entire naval fleet. That the child he'd dismissed for 25 years was one of the most respected officers in the United States Navy. That every comfortable moment of his life for the past 15 years had been built on the career he'd mocked, the job he'd called a waste, the daughter he'd declared worthless. He found the article about James, too. My husband, Commander James Reeves, killed in action during rescue operations. A hero's funeral, attended by admirals and fellow officers and hundreds of sailors who'd served with him. The article mentioned that Captain Alina Vasquez had delivered the eulogy, speaking about her husband's courage and sacrifice while fighting back tears. The funeral my father had been too busy to attend. The message my family had reduced to a text. David told me that my father called him the next day, trying to understand the financial arrangements. How had Alina been paying their mortgage? Where had Marcus's investor funding come from? What was the scholarship fund that had covered Sophia's tuition? David, loyal to the end, told him nothing. I'm not at liberty to discuss my client's financial arrangements, he said. If you have questions for Captain Vasquez, I suggest you contact her directly. But they couldn't contact me directly. I was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, commanding a carrier strike group, doing the job they'd spent decades belittling. By the time I returned to American waters, my father's 70th birthday would be approaching, and the family would be in ruins. I received one more message before returning home, this one from Sophia. The sister who had called my career meaningless, who had laughed at my costume with my father and cousin, who had accepted $240,000 of my money while believing she'd earned everything herself. Alina, I don't understand what's happening. There are articles about you online and they say you're a captain, like a real captain of an aircraft carrier. And there's something about money, about some trust fund, and Marcus is saying, I don't know what's true anymore. Please call me, please. There was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Uncertainty, fear, the beginning of understanding. I saved the message but didn't respond. Let her sit with that uncertainty. Let her wonder. Let her feel, for just a moment, what it was like to reach out to someone and receive nothing in return. The ship turned toward home in late June. As we sailed east, I thought about what awaited me. A family in crisis, a father confronted with the truth he'd spent decades denying, siblings who'd built their identities on achievements funded by someone they dismissed as worthless. I could have saved them again. One phone call to David, and the payments would resume. The mortgage would be caught up, Marcus's business would be bailout out, Sophia's loans would disappear back into the void of my generosity. I could fix everything, just like I always had. But I remembered standing in that hallway on Christmas Eve, listening to my father call me slow, watching my family laugh at the idea that I could ever be important. I remembered James's voice telling me they didn't deserve my loyalty. I remembered my grandmother's service pin, tucked in my pocket even now, reminding me that some battles aren't worth fighting. They had lived on the waves I commanded while mocking the sea. Now the tide was going out, and they would have to learn what I had always known. The ocean doesn't care about your opinions. It only cares about whether you can swim. My father's 70th birthday party was scheduled for July 15th. I would be there. But this time, I wouldn't arrive as the invisible daughter, the family failure, the woman who floated around on boats while everyone else built real lives. This time, they would see exactly who I was, and they would finally understand the cost of their contempt. The Roosevelt docked in San Diego on July 10th, 5 days before my father's birthday party. 5 days to prepare for a confrontation 25 years in the making. I spent those days handling the transition of command responsibilities, ensuring my crew was properly settled after our deployment, attending to the thousand small details that come with bringing a carrier strike group home. My sailors had performed brilliantly during our time at sea. They deserved my full attention, even as my mind wandered to what awaited me in Virginia. On July 13th, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen knocked on the door of my office. Sarah had served as my aide for 3 years, one of the most capable officers I'd ever worked with. She knew pieces of my family situation, enough to understand why I'd been quieter than usual since Christmas. "Captain, you have visitors, 2 lieutenants from the ceremonial guard. They say they're here on orders from Vice Admiral Patterson." I frowned. Vice Admiral Patterson was the commander of Naval Surface Forces Pacific, my direct superior. We had a good relationship built on mutual respect and years of service, but I couldn't imagine why he'd send ceremonial personnel to see me. "Send them in." The 2 lieutenants entered and stood at attention, both in dress whites, both young and crisp and utterly serious. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and perfect posture, spoke first. "Captain Vasquez, Vice Admiral Patterson sends his regards. He's been informed that you'll be attending a family event on the 15th and believes it's appropriate for you to have a proper escort." I stared at her. "An escort?" "Yes, ma'am. The Admiral feels that given your accomplishments and rank, you should arrive in a manner befitting your position. We've been assigned to accompany you, along with 2 additional personnel for security and logistics." I didn't know what to say. Patterson and I had served together years ago, when he was a captain and I was a junior officer. He'd mentored me through some of the most difficult moments of my career, always pushing me to reach higher, to accept the recognition I'd earned. He must have heard about my family situation somehow, perhaps through the Navy's informal network of officers who looked out for each other. "Lieutenant, that won't be necessary. It's just a birthday party." "With respect, ma'am, the Admiral disagrees." He said, and I quote, "Captain Vasquez has spent her entire career letting other people define her. It's time she walked into a room and let them see exactly who she is." Sarah was watching from the doorway, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She'd heard me talk about my family, about the years of dismissal and mockery. She understood what this gesture meant. I looked at the 2 lieutenants, their uniforms perfect, their bearing impeccable. Representatives of the Navy I had devoted my life to serving. The Navy that had seen my potential when my own father couldn't, that had trained me and challenged me and promoted me based on merit rather than bloodline. "Very well," I said finally. "Tell Vice Admiral Patterson I accept his offer, and please convey my gratitude." The lieutenant allowed herself a small smile. "He said you'd resist at first, ma'am. He also said to tell you that this is a direct order, so you don't really have a choice." For the first time in months, I laughed. July 15th arrived with the kind of perfect summer weather that felt almost scripted. Clear blue skies, temperature in the low 80s, just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. I spent the morning in my quarters at the naval base, preparing for what lay ahead. My dress white uniform hung on the closet door, freshly pressed and immaculate. 4 captain's stripes on the sleeves, marking my rank. On the chest, my medals were arranged in precise rows. The Bronze Star with its distinctive red, white, and blue ribbon. The Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The Meritorious Service Medal with 2 gold stars indicating additional awards. Campaign ribbons from deployments across the Pacific. Each decoration represented years of service, sacrifice, and achievement that my family had never bothered to learn about. I dressed slowly, deliberately. The white uniform jacket fitting perfectly across my shoulders, tailored to my frame during my last promotion. The medals catching the light from the window. The gold buttons gleaming. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not the invisible daughter, not the family failure, but Captain Elena Vasquez, commanding officer of Carrier Strike Group 7. This was who I had become while they were laughing. This was what they had dismissed as a little boat job. The black SUVs arrived at noon. 2 vehicles, both with tinted windows and government plates. Lieutenant Commander Chen had insisted on coming along, though I'd tried to tell her it wasn't necessary. "You've had my back for 3 years, Captain," she said simply. "I'm not letting you face this alone." The 2 ceremonial lieutenants were waiting when I stepped outside. They snapped to attention immediately, their salutes crisp and perfect. I returned the salute, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. "Ma'am, your escort is ready," the female lieutenant announced. "ETA to the destination is approximately 45 minutes. We drove through San Diego, then onto the highway toward Virginia via military transport arranged by Patterson's office. The journey took most of the day, with a brief stop at Andrews Air Force Base before the final drive to my brother's house in suburban Virginia. Marcus's house, which was now being sold to cover his debts. The location of my father's 70th birthday party, chosen because my parents' house was in foreclosure. As we approached the neighborhood, I saw the signs of a celebration. Cars lining the street, balloons tied to the mailbox, people milling about in Marcus's front yard. It was exactly the kind of gathering my family loved, full of extended relatives and neighbors, and people who could witness their performative success. I wondered if they knew that success was built on my money. I wondered if they'd figured it out yet, or if they were still clinging to their delusions. The SUVs turned onto the street, and I watched the reaction ripple through the crowd. Heads turning, conversations stopping, people pointing at the black vehicles with government plates rolling slowly past the parked cars. This was not the kind of transportation that usually appeared at Vasquez family gatherings. We stopped in front of the house. The lieutenants exited first, their dress whites stark against the summer green of the lawn. They moved to positions on either side of my door, standing at attention, creating an honor guard that drew every eye in the vicinity. I took a deep breath. 25 years of waiting, 15 years of invisible support, 1 moment to change everything. Lieutenant Chen opened my door. I stepped out. The sun caught my medals immediately, sending small flashes of light across the crowd. My uniform was blinding white, impeccable, unmistakably military. 4 captain's stripes clearly visible on my sleeves. The weight of my service displayed on my chest for anyone who cared to look. The female lieutenant's voice rang out across the sudden silence, clear and commanding. "Make way for Captain Vasquez, commanding officer, Carrier Strike Group 7. The effect was instantaneous. I heard gasps from the crowd, saw phones being raised to capture the moment. A neighbor, an older man I vaguely recognized as a retired enlisted sailor, dropped his drink. "My God," he said loudly. "She commands an aircraft carrier." I walked forward, my lieutenants flanking me, Lieutenant Commander Chen following at a respectful distance. The crowd parted like water before the bow of a ship. Faces I'd known my entire life stared at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, disbelief, the dawning recognition that everything they thought they knew was wrong. My father stood on the front porch, frozen mid-sentence. He'd been holding court as usual, surrounded by relatives hanging on his every word. Now he looked like a man watching his own house burn down, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. Behind him, I saw Marcus, his phone clutched in his hand. He'd been Googling foreclosure lawyers that morning, I would learn later. Now he stared at me like I was a ghost, his face pale and sweating despite the summer heat. Sophia stood near the door, a glass of wine suspended halfway to her lips. The glass slipped from her fingers as I approached, shattering on the porch and sending red wine splashing across the white painted boards. She didn't seem to notice. Diana had backed up against the wall of the house, physically recoiling from my approach. The designer dress she was wearing, the one I knew Marcus had bought with the last of his credit, suddenly looked cheap and desperate. And my mother stood apart from the others, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of shock. They were tears of something more complicated. Relief, perhaps, or shame, or maybe just the release of decades of secrets finally coming to light. I climbed the porch steps, my footsteps deliberate and measured. Each step felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me. My dignity, my worth, my right to be seen. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing that something momentous was happening. Neighbors who had heard my father mock my boat job for years were watching the reality unfold before them. Extended family members who had absorbed the narrative of Alina, the failure, were confronting evidence that couldn't be denied. I stopped in front of my father, Richard Vasquez, 70 years old today, a man who had spent his entire life diminishing others to feel larger himself. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, shrunken. The confident patriarch reduced to a confused old man in the face of truth he couldn't dismiss. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said. My voice was calm, even. The voice I used on the bridge of my carrier, the voice that commanded thousands. "I hope I'm not interrupting." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his life, Richard Vasquez had nothing to say. A child's voice cut through the silence, loud and curious in the way only children can be. "Is she a real captain, like in the movies?" The retired sailor answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Kid, she's more than that. She commands an entire carrier strike group. That means aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, thousands of sailors. She's one of the highest-ranking women in the whole damn Navy." I felt the words settle over the crowd like a weight. All those years of mockery, all those comments about my little boat job, all those assumptions that I was nothing. The truth was finally, undeniably visible. My father found his voice at last, though it came out weak and uncertain. "Alina, what is this?" I looked at him, this man who had torn up my acceptance letter, who had skipped my commissioning, who had ignored my husband's funeral, who had told everyone I'd never contributed anything to this family. "This is who I've been for 20 years, Dad. You just never bothered to look." The silence that followed my words was suffocating. I watched my father's face cycle through emotions like a ship passing through storm systems. Confusion gave way to denial, denial to recognition, recognition to something that looked almost like fear. "This is some kind of joke," he said finally, his voice gaining strength from desperation. "You can't be. You work on boats. You've always just worked on boats." "I command boats, Dad, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, an entire strike group with over 5,000 sailors who depend on me to lead them." I kept my voice level, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing anger. "I've been doing it for years. You just decided I was worthless, so you never bothered to find out what I actually do." His eyes dropped to my medals, scanning the rows of ribbons and decorations as if seeing them for the first time. The bronze star caught his attention, and I saw him recognize it. Even someone who'd spent decades dismissing the military couldn't miss the significance of that particular medal. "The Bronze Star," he whispered. That's for combat." "Yes, it is." The recognition was hitting him in waves now, each realization crashing harder than the last. "The money," he said suddenly, his voice cracking. "The mortgage, the payments that stopped, that was all you." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was written across my chest in medals and ribbons, visible in the lieutenant standing at attention behind me, undeniable in the government vehicles parked at the curb. Marcus stepped forward, his face a mask of desperation and dawning horror. "Elena, I didn't know. You should have told us, if we'd known you were. If we'd understood." "Understood what, Marcus?" I turned to face my brother, this man who had laughed at my little boat job while wearing a Rolex I'd paid for. "That I was funding your businesses. That every angel investor who bilaid you out was actually your sister, sending money from aircraft carriers deployed thousands of miles away." His face went white. "The investor, the one who pulled out, that was you. $80,000 for your first restaurant, $60,000 for your second venture, another $40,000 when the third one started failing." I watched him do the math, watched the numbers add up to a truth he couldn't escape. "You thanked Dad every time. You never once thought to thank me." "I didn't know," he repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "How could I have known?" "You could have asked. You could have wondered where a mysterious investor kept coming from at exactly the right moment. You could have paid attention to your sister instead of dismissing her as worthless." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But you didn't want to know. It was easier to believe you'd earned everything yourself." Sophia had retrieved her dropped wineglass and was clutching the stem like a lifeline. Her perfect composure, the cool confidence of the successful dermatologist, had shattered along with the glass. "The scholarship," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The foundation that paid my tuition. $240,000 over 4 years. I created the foundation, funded it, even wrote the acceptance letter you received." I met her eyes, saw the tears forming. "You wrote a thank you note to a fictional organization. I have that letter in a box at home, along with every other piece of evidence of my invisible support." "Elena, She couldn't finish the sentence. What was there to say? She had called my career meaningless at a graduation I'd paid for. She had laughed about my costume while benefiting from my sacrifice. Diana tried next, her voice dripping with a sweetness I'd never heard from her before. "Elena, we always knew you were special. This family has always been so proud of." I didn't even dignify her with a response. I simply looked at her, let my gaze rest on her designer dress, her expensive jewelry, all the trappings of a lifestyle funded by money that was never hers. She withered under that look, backing away until she bumped into the porch railing. My father was still processing, his mind clearly racing through years of memories, re-examining every moment through the lens of this new truth. "Your husband," he said suddenly. "James, the funeral, we didn't." "You sent a text message." The words came out flat, emotionless. "My husband died saving 6 sailors during a rescue operation. The Navy buried him with full honors. Admirals attended. Hundreds of sailors came to pay respects. And my family sent a text message because you were too busy to attend." I saw the impact of those words hit him physically. He actually stumbled backward, reaching for the porch railing to steady himself. Good. Let him feel a fraction of what I'd felt, standing at James's grave while my phone buzzed with their pathetic condolences. "Elena, I'm sorry." The words were small, inadequate. "I didn't understand. I never realized." "You taught me that I was worthless, Dad." I stepped closer to him, close enough that he had to look up to meet my eyes. "You tore up my acceptance letter and told me the military was no place for a girl. You skipped my commissioning to play golf. You spent 25 years telling everyone I was the slow one, the failure, the child who never contributed anything. And I believed you." He shook his head, whether in denial or confusion I couldn't tell. "I never meant." "Yes, you did. You meant every word. You needed me to be small so you could feel big. You needed me to be worthless so your failures would seem less significant by comparison." I felt the anger rising now, controlled but undeniable. But here's what you never understood, Dad. While you were mocking me, I was becoming something. I was leading sailors through combat operations. I was evacuating civilians from typhoons. I was making decisions that affected international policy, while you were telling cousins I'd never amount to anything. The crowd was watching in rapt silence. Neighbors who had heard my father's dismissive comments for years were seeing the full picture for the first time. Extended family members were reevaluating every assumption they'd ever made about the quiet daughter who floated around on boats. My father tried to rally, grasping for the familiar ground of family obligation. Well, family helps family. That's what we always taught you. That's what matters, right? That we support each other. The audacity of it actually made me laugh, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. Family helps family? Is that what you call it? I helped this family for 15 years, Dad. I paid your mortgage, funded your children's careers, covered your credit cards, bylaid you out of every crisis. And you repaid me by telling everyone I was useless. I didn't know, he said again, the refrain becoming pathetic. You never told us. I stopped telling you when I was 17 and you tore up my future. I stopped expecting you to listen when you skipped my commissioning. I stopped hoping you'd see me when you ignored my husband's funeral. I shook my head slowly. I gave you 15 years to notice, 15 years to wonder where the money was coming from, 15 years to ask a single question about my life. You never did. My mother approached then, moving through the frozen tableau of family members to stand before me. Tears streamed down her face, her makeup ruined, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. I knew, she whispered. Elena, I've always known, I was afraid, your father, he never. I should have said something, I should have defended you. I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I looked at her, this woman who had watched my father destroy my acceptance letter and said nothing, who had witnessed decades of dismissal and never spoken up, who had known the truth and kept it secret out of fear and complacency. But I also saw the mother who had held me when I cried as a child, who had quietly encouraged me to apply to the academy despite my father's opposition, who had sent care packages to every deployment, even when she couldn't tell anyone she was doing it. I embraced her. It was brief, just a moment of contact, but I felt her shoulders shake with sobs. She was complicit, yes, but she was also a victim of the same man who had diminished me. Perhaps she deserved some grace. I released her and turned back to face the rest of them. Marcus, pale and sweating. Sophia, tears ruining her perfect makeup. Diana, pressed against the railing like she wanted to disappear. My father, aged 10 years in 10 minutes, finally confronting the truth he'd spent decades denying. I didn't come here for an apology, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the yard. I came to tell you that the payments won't resume, not because I can't afford them. I could buy this house in cash tomorrow if I wanted to, but I won't, because you need to learn what I learned at sea. I paused, letting the silence stretch, feeling the weight of every word I was about to deliver. You can't sail on someone else's strength forever. Eventually, the ocean demands that you learn to swim on your own. My father's face crumpled. Elena, please, we're family. We're your family. You were my family, I said quietly. You could have been my family. Instead, you were a mission. And now that mission is complete. I turned to face him one final time. The man who had shaped my entire life through his rejection, who had driven me to achieve more than he could ever imagine simply because he'd told me I couldn't. You lived on the waves, I commanded, while mocking the sea, Dad. Now you'll have to learn to swim. I turned and walked down the porch steps, my lieutenants falling into step beside me. The crowd parted again, but this time the silence was different. There was respect in it. Awe, perhaps. The neighbors who had spent years absorbing my father's narrative about his worthless daughter were seeing reality for the first time, and they didn't know how to process it. I was halfway to the SUV when I heard footsteps behind me. Running footsteps, desperate and uneven. My father's voice called out, cracked and pleading in a way I'd never heard before. Elena, wait, please wait. I stopped but didn't turn around. My lieutenants paused with me, their posture alert, ready to intervene if necessary. Behind me, I could hear my father's labored breathing as he caught up. "Elena," he was standing behind me now, close enough that I could hear the tremor in his voice. "I'm your father." I turned slowly to face him. Richard Vasquez stood in his own driveway, surrounded by the wreckage of the birthday party that would become neighborhood legend, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. Perhaps he was. "You were my father," I said. The words came out calm, almost gentle. Not because I had forgiven him, but because I had finally moved beyond the need for his approval. "You could have been my family. Instead, you were my mission. A problem I kept solving, a crisis I kept preventing, a sinking ship I kept bailing out." "I didn't know," he whispered. "If I had known." "You would have what? Treated me differently because I was successful, respected me because I had money and power." I shook my head slowly. "That's not family, Dad. That's transaction. And I've spent 15 years on the wrong side of that transaction, giving everything and receiving nothing but contempt." He reached for me, his hand trembling. "Please, Elena, give me a chance to make it right. Give us a chance to be a real family." I looked at that outstretched hand, the same hand that had torn up my acceptance letter when I was 17. The same hand that had waved dismissively every time my career came up in conversation. The same hand that had never once reached out to comfort me, support me, or acknowledge my existence as anything other than a disappointment. "You had 25 years to make it right. 25 years to ask a single question about my life. 25 years to attend one ceremony, one deployment party, one moment that mattered to me." I met his eyes and saw the tears forming. "You didn't want a daughter, Dad. You wanted a mirror that reflected your own success back at you. And when I refused to be that mirror, you decided I was worthless." I was wrong. The words seemed to cost him everything. Richard Vasquez, the man who had never admitted fault in his life, stood before me in complete surrender. "I was wrong about everything. About you, about the Navy, about what matters. Please, Elena, please give me a chance to prove I can change." For a moment, I felt something soften inside me. Some small part of the girl who had desperately wanted her father's approval stirred at his words. It would be so easy to relent, to accept his apology, to resume the payments, to slip back into the role of invisible provider while hoping that this time would be different. But I had learned something important during my years at sea. Hope without evidence is just wishful thinking. And my father had given me no evidence that he could change, only words spoken in desperation, when the consequences of his contempt had finally caught up with him. "I hope you can change, Dad. I genuinely do." I took a step back, creating distance between us. "But I'm not going to fund that journey. You'll have to find your own way now." I walked to the SUV and climbed inside. Through the tinted window, I watched my father standing alone in the driveway, his shoulders slumped, his face crumpled with grief. The neighbors were watching too, whispering among themselves. This birthday party would be remembered for decades. As we pulled away, I allowed myself one last look at the house. Marcus had collapsed onto the porch steps, his head in his hands. Sophia was being comforted by a cousin, her sobs audible even through the closed car window. Diana had disappeared, probably already planning her exit from a marriage that no longer offered the status she craved. My mother stood apart from the others, watching our vehicle with an expression I couldn't quite read. That was the last time I saw my father at that house. 3 months later, the foreclosure was finalized, and my parents moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. The neighbors talked about the fall of the Vasquez family for years afterward, about the birthday party where the Navy captain arrived in government SUVs and destroyed her father with nothing but the truth. Marcus declared bankruptcy 6 months after the party. His business, stripped of its invisible funding, collapsed within weeks. Diana filed for divorce before the bankruptcy was even finalized, taking what little remained and disappearing to Miami with a man she'd apparently been seeing for months. I can't say I was surprised. She had married Marcus for his apparent success, and when that success evaporated, so did she. Sophia struggled the longest. The dermatologist who had convinced herself she'd earned everything alone had to face the reality of medical school debt she'd never actually paid. She sold her luxury car, downsized her apartment, and started working extra shifts to make ends meet. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to earn something herself. 2 years after the birthday party, she sent me a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter on proper stationery. She apologized for every dismissive comment, every cruel joke, every moment she'd participated in diminishing me. She thanked me for the education I'd funded and admitted she didn't deserve it. She told me about the life she was building now, a smaller life but one that was genuinely hers. I read that letter 3 times. Then I put it in a box with all the other evidence of my invisible support and didn't respond. Not because I was being cruel, but because I wasn't ready. Healing takes time, and some wounds need years to close. Maybe someday I'll write back. Maybe someday we'll rebuild what was broken, but not yet. My mother was different. 3 months after the party, she left my father. She called me from a hotel room, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in years, and asked if I meant what I'd said about helping her if she left. I had a separate account set up within the hour, enough for her to start over, to build a life free from the man who had diminished both of us. We talk regularly now. Not about the past, not about what she failed to do or say, but about the present. She's living in a small apartment near the coast, taking art classes, reconnecting with friends my father had driven away over the years. She's becoming someone new, someone she might have been if she'd had the courage to leave decades ago. It's not forgiveness exactly, but it's a start. As for my father, I've heard updates through my mother. He's alone now, in that small apartment, surrounded by the consequences of his choices. The man who spent his life making others feel small discovered that cruelty has a cost, and that cost came due all at once. I don't know if he's changed. I don't know if he's capable of changing, but I know that's no longer my responsibility to find out. I think about him sometimes, late at night when I'm standing on the bridge of my carrier, watching the stars reflect off an endless ocean. I think about the father he could have been, the family we could have had. I think about the girl who stood in his office with a torn acceptance letter, desperate for approval that would never come. But mostly, I think about how far I've traveled since then. Not just in miles or rank or achievement, but in understanding. I spent so many years believing I was invisible because my family refused to see me. But the truth is, I was never invisible. I was just looking for recognition in the wrong place. The Navy saw me. My sailors see me. James saw me, and even though he's gone, his love shaped me into someone who finally learned to see herself. My father raised me to be invisible. The Navy taught me to command. But in the end, I learned something neither could teach me. I was never invisible. They just refused to see. And now that I've stopped trying to make them look, I can finally see myself clearly. The sea has always known who I am, and that's enough. That's more than enough. I reach into my pocket and touch my grandmother's service pin, worn smooth by years of handling. She was right, all those years ago. The ocean doesn't care about their opinions. Neither do I, not anymore.